Duncan Farrell only meant to lift the duffel bag into the overhead rack and get his daughter settled before the train pulled out of Union Station. But his hand stopped halfway to the rack when the floor beneath him shifted in a way it shouldn't have. It was not a lurch. Via rail trains shifted during boarding. He knew this. He had spent 11 years in a trade where the difference between vibration that meant something and vibration that meant nothing was the kind of knowledge that lived in the hands before it reached the head. What he felt was not the rhythmic give of a car finding its load balance. It was asymmetric, a faint, persistent tremor along the left side of the car that held its pattern even after the movement on the platform stilled. He set the duffel bag on the seat instead of above it. He pressed the sole of his boot flat against the deck and waited. There it was again. Low, consistent, wrong for a passenger car sitting stationary at a platform with no engine load running through it. He had felt something like it once before, in a maintenance yard in Brampton, on a car that had been running a defective wheel bearing for 6 weeks before anyone flagged it for inspection. That car had been pulled from service. The report he had written afterward, about why it had taken 6 weeks to catch, had gone somewhere quiet and stayed there. His daughter Neve was watching him with the patient attention of a child who had learned early that when her father went still like this, the right thing to do was wait rather than interrupt. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes. Duncan still noticed it every morning at the breakfast table, and every night when he turned off the lamp she had left on while reading. He had been noticing it for 2 years, since Ellen had died, and he suspected he would go on noticing it for the rest of his life. He looked at Neve. He looked at the floor. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against the deck between the seats, feeling the way the vibration distributed across the surface and concentrated near the wall on the left side of the car, rather than spreading evenly the way normal transit movement did. He stood. He told Neve quietly and without urgency that he needed to speak to the conductor for a moment and that she should stay with the bags. Neve said okay. She said it in the specific tone that meant she would be fine and that he should go do what he needed to do. The conductor's name, as it appeared on the badge clipped to the breast pocket of her uniform jacket, was Denise Carruthers. She was at the forward end of the car managing a departure that was already 2 minutes behind the posted schedule. She had the brisk efficiency of someone for whom the boarding sequence had its own momentum, and anything that interrupted it arrived as friction. Duncan introduced himself. He told her he had noticed a vibration in the car deck that appeared to originate from the undercarriage on the left side, and that the pattern was inconsistent with normal boarding movement. He used the specific language of someone who understood what he was describing and why it mattered. Denise Carruthers listened with the expression of a person waiting for a conversation to end. When he stopped, she told him the trains were inspected before every service run. That vibration during boarding was completely normal, and that they would be departing shortly. Duncan said he understood, but that the vibration he was describing was not the kind that resolved once the car was loaded. He said it had a frequency pattern consistent with a wheel bearing issue or a misaligned truck assembly, and that at speed those conditions did not stay stable. He said it calmly, without drama. Denise Carruthers looked at him then, not at his face initially, at the entirety of him, the worn canvas jacket, the work boots with dried mud still in the treads, the duffel bag visible at his shoulder, and the girl sitting 2 rows back watching them with the quiet attentiveness of a child who already knew how to read a room. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have already sorted and are now confirming fits the category. She told him, in a voice that carried cleanly to the nearest 4 rows of seated passengers, that he was not a rail technician, and that he should leave the mechanical concerns to the people who were qualified to assess them. Someone behind Duncan made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space. A man in a business blazer seated near the window lifted his phone, and resumed whatever he had been doing before, which was its own kind of dismissal. Neve had heard it. Duncan did not need to turn around to know this. He could feel it the same way he felt the vibration in the deck. Through something below conscious thought, the particular awareness of a parent whose child is nearby and absorbing something they shouldn't have to absorb. He said to Denise Carruthers, without raising his voice, that he was not asking her to take his word for it. He was asking her to pass the observation to the mechanical team so that someone qualified could make the call. He said, if they found nothing, he would sit down and not bother anyone for the rest of the trip to Ottawa. Denise Carruthers picked up her radio and spoke into it with the tone of someone dispatching a minor inconvenience. She told the service desk that there was a passenger in car 7 who believed he had found a problem with the undercarriage. She said the word believed with a slight elevation in pitch that landed the way it was intended. At the operations desk at the far end of the train, Senior Rail Operations Officer Walter Koenig had been reviewing the departure manifest when Denise's call came through. He had been with Via Rail for 22 years, and before that had spent 7 years with a private rail maintenance contractor in the Greater Toronto area. He was the kind of person who took radio calls the same way every time, listened fully, asked one question, made a decision. He asked Denise to read him the passenger's name from the manifest. There was a pause. She hadn't expected that. She checked. She read out the name attached to seat 12 in car 7. Duncan Farrell. Walter Koenig set his pen down on the desk. He sat very still for a moment, the way a person sits when something unexpected connects itself to something they already know, and the connection requires a second to resolve. Then he stood, reached for his jacket, and walked the length of the train toward car 7. He had not thought about that name in several years, but it had not faded the way incidental names did. It had stayed because of a document. A 43-page technical assessment of wheel bearing inspection intervals in heavy corridor rail stock, submitted to Transport Canada and the Rail Safety Registry by a mechanical integrity analyst at a company called Blackridge Transit Services. The document had outlined with careful, unglamorous precision how the industry standard inspection interval for a specific class of wheel bearing was insufficient for cars running high-frequency service routes. It had named the failure conditions. It had described the progression sequence. It had included field data from 6 maintenance cycles that the author had collected without authorization from his direct supervisors, because the direct supervisors had declined to authorize the collection. Blackridge's legal team had responded within 3 weeks. They had described the findings as speculative and outside the author's authorized scope. The author had been reassigned, and then, some months later, not reassigned to anything at all. Walter had come across the document through a colleague at a safety symposium who'd mentioned it almost in passing. He had read it twice. He had kept a copy. He had, in his own quiet way, adjusted the internal inspection protocols for the cars under his operational responsibility in the years since, citing other sources in the documentation, because citing Farrell directly would have required explanations he had not been positioned to give at the time. He walked into car 7. The effect was immediate. A senior operations officer entering a passenger car mid-boarding without announcement did not happen in the normal order of things. Heads turned. The ambient sound of settling passengers dropped. Walter walked directly to row 12. The man sitting there was not what the name had suggested in the abstract. The Duncan Farrell who had written the bearing assessment had existed in Walter's mind as a type. Methodical, institutional, credentialed. The man in seat 12 was wearing a jacket that had spent time outdoors. His daughter sat beside him, watching Walter approach with the steady, clear-eyed attention of someone who had been waiting for the next thing. Walter asked Duncan directly whether he was the Duncan Farrell, who had worked at Blackridge Transit Services in Brampton. The car went quiet in the way a train car goes quiet, when it becomes apparent that something is happening outside any category the passengers had arrived with. Denise Carruthers, who had followed at a distance of several rows, stopped walking. Duncan said yes. He said it simply, the way a person confirms something true that they have spent a long time not discussing. Walter told him to describe what he had felt. Duncan did. He described the frequency and the pattern of the vibration, the asymmetric distribution across the deck, the way it concentrated near the left wall of the car, the way it had persisted after all platform movement stilled. He described what those characteristics were mechanically consistent with and what they implied about the bearing assembly in the truck on the left side of the car. He described it without performance, without the emphasis of a man trying to prove something. He described it the way a person describes a measurement taken carefully and confirmed twice. Walter listened fully. He asked one question, whether Duncan had noticed the pattern before boarding movement or only during. Duncan said before boarding movement, and again when he pressed his palm flat against the deck, which was when the asymmetry became unambiguous. Walter nodded once and reached for his radio. The maintenance team arrived in two: Lou, a senior rail mechanic with 16 years on the carrier, and Preet, a younger technician working under Lou's certification. They had the measured pace of professionals whose entire working culture was organized around not appearing alarmed, because alarm was expensive, and because in rail maintenance, alarm usually meant the problem was already too far along to have stayed invisible. Lou assessed the car from below the platform using the inspection scope, and then with the ultrasonic detection unit that measured bearing wear through frequencies the human body could not reliably detect. What the unit found was not catastrophic in the immediate sense. It was not a bearing approaching total seizure, but it was a bearing that had reached the outer edge of its acceptable wear tolerance, and in a way that the standard visual inspection cycle was not designed to catch, because the standard visual inspection looked for surface deformation that only became visible after the measurement threshold had already been crossed. Lou photographed the readings. He and Preet conferred in low voices. Then Lou turned to Walter and said the car should be taken out of service for component replacement. He said the wear characteristics were consistent with a known failure mode in this class of truck assembly. He said something else. He said the bearing in question carried a maintenance code that appeared in a service advisory issued 8 years prior, recommending enhanced inspection intervals for cars running the Toronto-Ottawa corridor due to load and thermal cycling patterns. The advisory had been interpreted as a recommendation rather than a requirement. Standard intervals had continued. 8 years. Neve Farrell had been watching all of it from her seat, close enough to her father to feel the steadiness in him. The way he sat through the entire inspection, with his hands loose on his knees, not tense, not triumphant, just present and attentive and completely himself. She was old enough to recognize that the people in uniforms were now listening to her father, the way teachers listen to other teachers. She did not yet have the word for what she was watching, but she understood its shape. The moment when someone you love, who has been made small in public, becomes the tallest person in the room, without changing anything about themselves. She had watched her father go still when he felt the floor. She had watched him walk to the front of the car and speak in a voice that did not waver. She had watched the conductor look at his jacket and make a decision. She had heard the sound someone made in the rows behind him after that. She had seen her father's shoulders absorb it without shifting. She had also seen the moment the operations officer came through the door and walked toward her father with the direct intention of a person who had already decided something important. Her father pressed his hand briefly to her knee, the way he always did when he wanted to tell her, without words, that everything was being handled. Then he returned his attention to Lou and the readout on the ultrasonic unit and the technical conversation unfolding 3 feet away. What Duncan Farrell had been before he became a man in a worn jacket on a Tuesday morning train was not a story he had told in a long time. He had spent 11 years as a mechanical integrity analyst at Blackridge Transit Services. The work was quiet and invisible, tracking how rail components aged under operational stress, watching how small tolerances shifted across thousands of service hours, identifying failure patterns before they reached the threshold at which they became failures. He had been good at it, genuinely good at it, in the way that some people are good at things requiring pattern recognition and the patience to let a pattern fully emerge before naming it. The bearing assessment had been the product of 14 months of data collection. He had begun it after noticing in the maintenance records a recurring correlation between bearing wear rates and the service profile of the Toronto-Ottawa corridor cars. Long distances at sustained speed, higher load variability than the standard calculation assumed, thermal cycling between winter outdoor exposure and heated station environments. The correlations suggested that the standard inspection interval was running 4 to 6 months too long for this class of service. He raised it internally twice. The first time produced a working group. The working group met 3 times and concluded that existing protocols were adequate. The second time produced a directive that bearing concerns be channeled through the standard maintenance review schedule. The standard maintenance review schedule met quarterly. The quarterly meeting at which the issue was tabled lasted 40 minutes and reached no change in protocol. The assessment went outside those channels. He submitted it to Transport Canada's Rail Safety Directorate and to the Rail Safety Registry's public reporting mechanism. He submitted it because the pattern he had documented was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of measurement. The measurements pointed in one direction, and that direction was towards something that would not correct itself. Blackridge's response arrived in writing at the same time as a restructuring announcement that eliminated his position. The letter described the assessment as outside the scope of his authorized role. The restructuring documentation did not mention the assessment. There was no paper trail connecting the 2 events, which was itself a kind of thoroughness that Duncan had recognized at the time and found unsurprising. Ellen had been 4 months pregnant with Neve when the restructuring happened. He had found work with an industrial maintenance contractor within 6 weeks, work that used his mechanical knowledge in a different context, and paid adequately and required him to be precise and careful and present. He had applied those qualities fully to the new work. He had only stopped applying them to the specific problem he had once tried to make the industry acknowledge. Ellen had not asked him to stop, but she had known he had put it down. He had seen in her face that she was glad of it, that the work of building their life together was also real work, not consolation work. She had died 26 months ago, a March morning at Sunnybrook in Toronto, with snow coming down outside the window in the heavy, reluctant way Toronto snow fell in early spring. He had been holding her hand when she stopped. Neve had been in Ottawa with Ellen's parents. He had driven back to collect her 3 days later, with the radio off and his daughter asleep in the back seat, and the highway empty, the way highways were empty, before the rest of the world had started its mourning. Neve was the reason the weight of it was manageable. Not in the compensatory sense people meant when they said children were a comfort in hard times, which he found well-intentioned but imprecise. More that her existence created a daily structural requirement for presence. He had to get up, he had to make breakfast, he had to notice whether she had slept and whether her library book was in her bag and whether she had eaten enough. The alternative to being present, the thing grief became when it was not interrupted by the obligations of being a parent, was, as a result, structurally unavailable to him. He had taught her, without precisely intending it as a curriculum, to pay attention, to treat what something actually was as more interesting than what it appeared to be at first. She had asked him once why he always read instructions before touching anything unfamiliar. He had said that most broken things announced themselves before they broke, and that attention was the difference between catching the announcement and missing it. She had written that down in her notebook. Transport Canada's rail safety inspector for the Ontario district arrived at Union Station 50 minutes after the maintenance flag was filed. Her name was Priya Chadha, and she had the particular energy of someone who had spent 15 years working in a field where the distance between a process anomaly and a serious incident was often small and always worth treating seriously. She reviewed Lou's photographs and the ultrasonic readings and the service advisory records, and asked Walter Koenig a sequence of questions that were methodical and unsparing. Then she asked to speak to the passenger who had identified the issue. She found Duncan and Neve in the waiting area near the track entrance, where passengers from Car 7 had been moved while the substitute car was prepared. Neve was working through a bag of trail mix with a migratory birds book open on her lap. Duncan was seated beside her, looking at the middle distance with the expression of a person who has been through something and is now sitting in the quiet on the other side of it. Priya introduced herself. She said she intended to cross-reference the maintenance advisory deviation with the technical assessment submitted to the registry 9 years ago. She said the document had been logged at the time, but filed in the informal advisory category, which carried no mandated follow-through. She said that if the wear pattern found today was consistent with the failure progression documented in that assessment, the review would need to expand to the other cars running the same service corridor. Duncan listened to all of this and recognized the feeling it produced, not as satisfaction, not as vindication in the clean sense he might once have imagined. Something quieter and more complicated. The particular sensation of something that has been true for a long time, sitting in a drawer no one was required to open, finally being taken out and held in proper light. He had not come to Union Station that morning expecting any of it. He had come to take his daughter on the train to Ottawa to spend a long weekend with her grandparents, Ellen's parents, who asked for Neve with the frequency of people who understood that the connection she represented was one that time was making more rather than less important. He told Priya that the wear pattern she would find was almost certainly not limited to one bearing in one car, that the service advisory deviation was likely environmental, a maintenance culture that had defaulted to the shorter inspection pathway whenever the regulatory language permitted interpretation. Not because anyone had decided to take risks deliberately, but because the operational pressure to minimize turnaround time was constant, and thoroughness was only measured when something went wrong. He said a review focused on the specific bearing rather than the culture that had allowed it to be inadequately inspected would produce a corrective action without a correction. Priya took notes in a particular way, pen moving steadily, no abbreviations, looking up between sentences to confirm she had the meaning right. Duncan recognized the quality as one he had only ever found in people he trusted in this industry. He said, half to Priya and half to the shape of the problem itself, that rail systems did not fail because of one worn bearing. They failed because enough people agreed that the worn bearing was a matter for the next inspection cycle. Priya said she agreed with him. She said it without embellishment, which was its own form of credibility. The replacement car took just over 2 hours to prepare and position. The passengers from Car 7 were reboarded last, which meant they had stood in the waiting area long enough to understand, through the accumulation of overheard conversations and the purposeful movement of uniforms, that something significant had actually happened. A woman named Bia, who had been seated directly across the aisle from Duncan, and who had registered the conductor's remark with the mild ambient satisfaction of a disruption being managed, found him at the charging station near Gate 9. She said she had ridden this route twice a month for 3 years, and had never once thought to wonder whether the equipment was safe. She said she now understood that the comfort of not thinking about it was a trust she had not examined. Duncan said that most people did not think about the infrastructure they moved through, and that this was mostly a reasonable way to live. He said the people thinking about it on their behalf were supposed to be doing so systematically, and the gap was in the system rather than in the passengers. She nodded and went back to her seat, and Duncan thought that she would likely not remember the conversation in a year, but that the next time she felt something unusual beneath her feet on a train, she would have a slightly different thought about it, and that this was not nothing. Walter Koenig came before the boarding line formed. He was not a person who made speeches. He said that for the better part of a decade, he had been calibrating internal inspection standards from the bearing assessment without being able to say openly where the calibrations came from. He said this with the plain honesty of a man acknowledging something he had been sitting with for a while and was ready to put on the table. Duncan said he appreciated Walter saying it directly. Walter said that what Duncan had done that morning on the platform, deciding to say something rather than setting the bag in the rack and sitting down, was the document having a second life it could not have had on its own. Duncan thought about this and said he supposed that was one way to frame it. He said what he had actually done that morning was press his boot sole to the floor and pay attention to what he felt. He said the rest of it had been other people doing their jobs correctly once they had something specific to respond to. Walter said that was true, and that the something specific was the part that had been missing for 9 years. Denise Carruthers found Duncan near the car, 7 boarding door 3 minutes before departure. She had clearly spent time deciding whether to approach. The uncertainty of that decision was still visible in the way she stopped a step and a half away rather than closer. She said she had not known who he was. Duncan looked at her and said that she had not needed to know who he was in order to listen to what he was saying. He said it without anger. The way a person states something they have needed to state for a long time and have waited until they could state it clearly. Denise was quiet. She had prepared for a version of this in which she apologized, and he accepted it, and the matter closed. What she had not prepared for was the sense that the matter was not the point, that the conversation was about something larger than the two of them and the minutes at the start of a boarding process. She turned to Neve. She told Neve directly that she was sorry for what she had said, and for saying it where Neve could hear it. She said Neve's father had been right, and she had been wrong to dismiss him, and that Neve did not deserve to have heard her father spoken to that way. Neve considered this with the gravity of a child who had recently revised her understanding of how adults worked. She said it was okay. She said it carefully. The way children say it when they mean something more conditional than the words themselves contain. Said to be kind, because kindness was something her mother had named and her father demonstrated daily, and she had absorbed it thoroughly enough that it was now simply something she did. Duncan told Denise that if she wanted to make productive use of what the morning had shown, the most useful thing was not the apology, but the adjustment. Specifically, building the habit of forwarding a concern rather than resolving it at the point of contact. Because the point of contact was not always the place where the relevant expertise lived. Denise said she understood. He said that the next time a passenger said something that made her impatient, her response in that moment would be a better measure of understanding than anything she said to him now. She absorbed this without flinching, which was something. She said quietly that she would not dismiss something like that again. He said the next one might not wait for her to be ready. She said she would be paying more attention. On the train, which pulled out of Union Station 17 minutes behind schedule, Neve took the window seat in the new car without hesitation. Duncan noticed this and said nothing about it. She looked out at the city receding past the platform edge with the composure of someone who had been afraid of something earlier in the day and had quietly decided, at some point in the hours that followed, not to be afraid of it anymore. She took her notebook out of her backpack, the small blue one with the elastic band that she had carried since the beginning of grade 2, and opened it to the next blank page. She sat with it open for a while, thinking in the particular thorough way she thought about most things. Then she wrote something and closed the notebook and slipped it back into her bag and looked out at the fields beginning to open east of the city, still brown at the edges where the Ontario autumn was finishing its slow work. Duncan sat beside her. He ran his hand along the armrest the way he always did in a new seat, not anxiously but attentively, cataloging the physical world around him with the quiet habitual consideration of a person for whom attention was not just professional habit but something closer to a value. The conductor for the new car moved through the aisle doing her pre-departure checks. When she reached row 12, she made brief eye contact with Duncan, gave a small nod, and continued. It was a small thing, the kind of acknowledgement that requires no explanation and registers only to someone who knows what the morning had contained. Niamh noticed. She did not say anything. The train accelerated out through the western corridor, and the hum of the car was even and calibrated. The sound of a system functioning as it was designed to function, maintained by people whose work was mostly invisible to everyone it kept safe. After a while, Niamh looked at her father and said, in the tone of someone arriving at the end of a thought she had been working through carefully, that he had been right and nobody had believed him, and then they had believed him. Duncan said that was more or less accurate. She said, did that happen a lot? He thought about it honestly. He said sometimes. He said the believing usually caught up. She said that seemed like a long time to wait. He said it was. She looked back out the window. The sky past Kingston was wide and gray and unambiguous in the way of October skies over flat Ontario farmland. After a while, she said that when she grew up, she was going to listen to people even when they didn't look like the kind of person you were supposed to listen to. Duncan looked at her. He looked at the fields. He said that sounded like a good plan. In the weeks that followed, Transport Canada's Rail Safety Directorate completed an expanded inspection of all corridor cars on the Toronto-Ottawa-Montreal service. Across 9 cars, 17 wheel bearings were identified with wear characteristics consistent with the failure progression. Duncan had documented 9 years earlier. All 17 were replaced before the cars returned to service. The formal inspection report cross-referenced the technical assessment by author and submission date, and reclassified it from the informal advisory file to the referenced findings record. A small administrative change, with a weight that Duncan felt when he read the notification on a Wednesday morning in his kitchen while Niamh ate breakfast and did not pay attention to what he was looking at on his phone. He put the phone face down on the table and poured more coffee. The consulting request arrived 3 weeks later from the Directorate's Safety Standards Office, asking him to contribute to a formal review of bearing inspection protocols across the corridor fleet. He read it at his workbench on a Thursday evening, while a replacement actuator for a food processing plant waited for his attention on the other side of the table. He thought about it for 2 days. He thought about the difference between walking back into something in order to prove a point and walking back into something because the work that needed doing was still there, undone, and he was still the person who understood how to do it. He called Niamh's school to check the date of the spring science fair. He wanted to plan around it. He accepted the consulting role on a part-time structure that accommodated Niamh's school schedule, with one condition written formally into the engagement terms, that the original assessment be cited in the new protocol documentation. Not for vindication, for accuracy. The document had been accurate for 9 years. Accuracy did not require vindication. It required acknowledgement, and the new protocol would provide it. He told Neve at dinner that he was going to be doing some different work for a while, work that involved making sure the trains people rode were safe. Neve looked up from her plate. She said, "Like what you did on the train." He said something like that. She considered this the way she considered most things, without rushing. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her dinner, and Duncan thought that was probably exactly the right response, and that Ellen would have said something similar, though she would have looked at him over it in the way she had of looking at him when she wanted him to know. She understood the full cost of what the decision had once been, and the particular kind of trust it required to try again. Neve's school held its career presentations in May. She had asked her father 3 weeks in advance what she should say about him, and he had told her to say whatever seemed true. She had taken this seriously, which was her nature. She stood at the front of her classroom in her good navy sweater and introduced her father with the careful gravity of a child who had thought hard about what accuracy required. She said her father used to work for a company that maintained trains, and that he had found something wrong that no one else had found, and that no one had listened to him for a long time, and that one day on a train he found the same kind of wrong thing again. And this time people listened, and the train was safe because of it. She said he was the kind of person who noticed things that other people had decided were not worth noticing. She said she was learning how to do that too. Duncan sat in the back of the classroom in a chair that had been designed for someone 30 years younger, and listened to his daughter describe him, and felt something he had not had a reliable name for since Ellen died. The particular lightness of being seen clearly, without flattery or distortion, by the person whose version of you was the only version that finally mattered. The morning that Denise Carruthers had looked at his jacket and decided she already knew who he was, she had made an error that was not exclusive to her. It was the error of a system that had learned to sort people before listening to them, and to use the sorting as sufficient reason not to listen. It was the same error that had received a 43-page technical assessment 9 years earlier and filed it in the category of things that carried no required follow-through. The error was not cruelty. It was something subtler and in some ways harder to correct, the habit of deciding, before a person finishes speaking, which category they belong to and whether that category is worth the time. On a Tuesday morning in October, at a platform at Union Station in Toronto, a man in a canvas work jacket had pressed the sole of his boot flat to the floor of a train car and paid attention to what he felt. He had done it the same way he did everything, without performance, without urgency, with the careful and unbroken attention of someone who had spent his working life learning the difference between noise and signal. The signal had been there. It had been there 9 years before, in a document in a registry file that no one was required to open. On that Tuesday morning it was there again, unchanged, patient, waiting for the same thing it had always been waiting for. Not a different signal. Just someone willing to stop and listen to the one that was already there.